The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of countless. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the very first day of the second in a row, 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate. We have this October-November duo, and this is the second part of it. A chance to go even deeper than it would be to go if you were just doing it as single sesshins. And it's a tremendous advantage. This is done at Sogenji when I was living there, actually 3 in a row. I hear they only do 2 in a row now, but I'm sure Roshi changes it up periodically. As has been said before, when you do another sesshin, soon after the first one is ended, very soon, within days, then you haven't had a chance to really come up for air. So you can go deeper within, and it's easier to do that. But today I'd like to share some things that aren't normally talked about in Zen in America. I met Nicolai Miller-McNann, Jikyo Roshi, who's now retired, as a result of a recommendation from Flora Courtois, who I'd gotten to know because her wonderful little book, An Experience of Enlightenment, which it was something that Yasutani Roshi asked her to write. She didn't volunteer it herself, which is says something about the depth to which she awakened in this experience of enlightenment. But it's a wonderful account of a process that hopefully would inspire all of us. And I know it inspired me for many, many years. And it was when the book went out of print that I contacted Flora and said the Rochester Zen Center would be very happy to reprint this. It's quite inspiring. And she wrote back and invited me out for a visit. She was living in Santa Barbara at the time. And so I visited her a number of times until her death from pneumonia. She was in her early 70s. But she had trained in psychology and got to know Nicolai, who was a student of Mayazumi Roshi as well. Flora eventually ended up a student of Mayazumi Roshi. And so did Nicolai. And in fact, Nicolai became one of his successors. And since she was in San Diego, it was easy to meet up with her whenever I was out there. Unfortunately, I don't go out there right now. And so we haven't seen each other in a while, but we always had lunch together, and it was always a great meeting, sharing thoughts, sharing insights, sharing about teaching. And she gave me at one point a little pamphlet that she had put together for her students. Because in America, our personalities are so different from the personalities of Japanese people. The culture is vastly different. And so when Zen came from Japan, it had no format for dealing with stuff that comes up during sesshin for Westerners. And so she wrote about it, and I'd like to share some of it because it's relevant, particularly since we're in this second in a row sesshin and things are likely to come up. The relationship with fellow students, the relationship with a teacher is the same as relationship with friends, parents, and so on. And the relationship with friends and parents is going to a certain degree, define how we react to the relationship with fellow students and with a teacher. And it's important to recognize that As the Buddha had so cogently said, we are products of conditioning. And as you've heard so many times in these teishos, we're born, how we are treated from that moment on brings us to define a certain relationship. I'm gonna sneeze. My brother always said that if you sneeze twice in a row, it's allergies. At any rate, it's an ongoing experiencing of the world through filters, the filter of interactions with other people. And those interactions with other people bring us to assumptions about how safe the world is, how friendly people are, how trustworthy people are, and so on and so forth. And there's a long and highly researched psychology around this these days. But this all impacts our Zen practice. Our relationship, as I said, with our fellow Sangha members, our relationship with a teacher, all of this is impacted by that way we grew up and how we interacted with other people. And so we can get something called transference and countertransference, in which case we assume things about what the other person is saying or doing. We project on them. One of the things is to, it's called the Vipassana romance. We're in a sesshin, and next to us is somebody we have never met in our whole life until we sat next to them in sesshin. And they arrived as we did just before sesshin began. And so we didn't have a chance to really get to know them to any degree whatsoever. We might even not have known their name. And yet, by the end of sesshin, we are not only fully in love with that person, but also have developed a story around happily ever after. We're going to have kids. We're going to live in this beautiful little house. We're going to have a wonderful life together. And you haven't even met the person. And this happens also with the teacher. And it is the teacher's responsibility as well to watch out that this doesn't happen from the teacher to the student. There have been way too many instances of inappropriate behavior on the part of Zen teachers in America, and it's caused untold suffering. So that's one of the things that can happen. When we enter Zen practice, it's usually a very romantic time. It's kind of exciting to be a Zen student, very cool thing to do, especially, I suppose, if you're living in California, where it's very cool to do certain kinds of things. Not so much in Illinois, but we all have this idea about how neat it would be to do Zen practice. And we may or may not fall in love with the teacher. From my own experience, I did not fall in love with either Roshi Keplo or Haruta Roshi. In fact, I was terrified of Keplo Roshi. By the time I got to Haruta Roshi, I had nothing but deep respect for him. And by that time, I also had discovered deep respect for Roshi Keplo as well. All of this can provide a matrix for misperception, misunderstanding, stuff. We have the honeymoon period, just like in any set of relationships. And then reality strikes, and sometimes the pendulum goes way beyond general reality into an opposing set of assumptions. And suddenly we hate the place. It's interesting that when we lived in Mandalay, Burma, it was a very challenging place to live. And both of our kids, one of them nearly died before we even got to Mandalay when we were living in Rangoon. of some sort of unrelenting dysentery that even if I fed him water by teaspoonfuls, it immediately went either back up or down through, and he was 9 months old. We almost lost him to that, and eventually it turns out he also ended up with TB. My older son ended up in the hospital in Rangoon back when they still had a Seventh-day Adventist hospital there, and had hernia surgery at the age of 3, barely 3. And then when we got to Mandalay, he ended up with antibiotic resistant ear infection that was so serious that we had him in the hospital in Mandalay because it was too risky to fly him back down to Rangoon and fly him over to Bangkok, where the nearest appropriate hospital was. And to this day, he has this very flat place behind one of his ears because they had to scrape the bone. The hospital itself was quite intense. We were in the so-called private ward, which was a big room. There were 2 big rooms separating these cots that were full of bed bugs with kind of movable partitions, low things like the old-fashioned blackboards in schools. And the 2 squatter toilets, there weren't any other toilets, were full of excrement and non-functioning. That was the hospital. It was known as a place where people went to die because they waited until the end anyway, because it was so frightening, even for the Burmese. He did survive, thankfully, and thrived. But all the things we dealt with, for example, the poisonous snakes in the tree outside in the backyard, beneath which was a bench, the cobras in the yard, the poisonous caterpillars, where even one hair of their black fur floating through the air would raise a big welt on you that would last for 3 weeks. And of course, these huge long centipedes that would come up through the crack in the basement floor. And then there were things like very early on, when the younger one had some kind of a cold or something. And so we were giving him baby aspirin on rare occasion. And one Saturday morning, his older brother, who was 2.5, came into the bedroom where we were taking a little bit more time and said, "I gave Greg his medicine." At which point we leapt out of bed and went, and the bottle was empty. And so we tried to make the kids gag. They wouldn't. So we took them to the local hospital, that same hospital. There was only one in Mandalay, a city of 300,000 people. And we said, please pump their stomachs. And they said, why? And they said, well, they took a lot of aspirin. Oh, it's only aspirin. Don't worry about it. Until the younger ones started staggering around. Then they were willing to pump the stomachs. And the younger one lay in a coma in his crib for the next 3 days as a result of that. This is what we encountered living in Burma, along with all the dysentery, the potential threat of, and it was a very real threat. There is a higher percentage, twice the percentage of leprosy in Burma for some unknown reason as there is in any other country in the world. And as it turns out, the wife of one of the consulate servants turned up positive along with one of her kids with whom my kids were playing. And so we had to ask them to move out because it's quite catching. We put on a happy face when we were there. It was actually quite interesting. We did get to travel unlike our Rangoon fellow diplomats. And that was always really, really interesting, although we had our sets of adventures, including the night we stayed in what was left of a government guest house that had been established by the British for the judges that used to ride circuit around the country back when the British controlled Burma and India. And the doors were long gone on the whole building. The building was up on stilts. We managed to find our way in the pitch black dark because it was midnight. They shut off the village generator and put our mosquito nets up on hang them on a hook on the wall. Not a hook, it was a nail sticking out of the wall. Roll out our bed rolls on the floor. And there was no furniture. That's fine, no problem there. And then the noise started down below. The kids to this day remember what they called the growly house. There were two tigers fighting over a dog. And when we realized what was happening, and we realized that there was not a single door behind which we could hide in that whole building, it was kind of sobering. They didn't come up the stairs, thankfully. I never knew what they did with the dog, but there was not even an outhouse, not even a hole in the dirt anywhere near that place. So it was, all we could do was try to find somewhere, a bush to hide behind to relieve ourselves. But that was no big deal. But the whole thing began to add up at some point. And when we returned to the United States nearly 3 years later, we find ourselves suddenly feeling quite negative and speaking quite negatively about the experiences we'd had there. Now, of course, it's evened out. It was pretty interesting living there. Thailand was a whole lot easier. But this kind of thing happens in human psychology. You put up with a challenging environment or a situation for a while, and then all of a sudden, wham. It's like one of those cartoon situations where you're walking along the floor and then you step on one end of a loose floorboard and the other end comes up and whaps you in the face. So it can happen, and it does. There were plenty of people who were furious at Hadada Rishi, plenty of people who were furious at Kepler Rishi. In fact, at one point, one guy decked him, just pulled out a fist and knocked him down. Hopefully nobody will do this here. But I remember in Doksan, Rishi Kepler always used to say, you demonstrate your koan, but you don't hit the teacher as part of it, even if part of it means hitting something or somebody. I have yet to meet a koan where that was the case. But anyway, enough experience he'd had with people whomping him that he had to say that ahead of time. The honeymoon period ends and the shit begins to hit the fan. And that's when we have an incredible opportunity to become free of our stuff. This is the advantage of anyone who has recognized that there is no other way but straight inward through Zen practice to become free of our pain and suffering. And even if our life is relatively nice, sooner or later, it'll flip, at least briefly, and we'll be disgruntled, or we'll be unhappy, or we don't like what it's like at that point in time and wish it was different. But Zen practice, seriously undergone, And that means walking into the physical experience of any of these things that come up can bring us to a point of freedom from them. It's a very challenging thing to do because we are so habituated, and the older we get without having to deal with it, the more habituated we are to fighting back instead of going inward, because that's one of the things that happens. We project outward. We assume that our problems are because of the environment or because somebody else is being a certain way. But the environment will always have its stuff, and other people will also have their stuff. And at one point, somebody asked the Buddha, how do you deal with this? And the Buddha said, well, you have a choice. You can try to upholster the entire earth in leather so that when you walk, your feet won't hurt, or you can put leather on the bottoms of your feet so that no matter where you walk, it's okay. Nick Lee also spoke about anger and rage, because that can come up for people. And she wrote about a student of Mayazumi Roshi who was very invested in being compassionate and sweet and kind-hearted. And of course, all of us have that within us. But in this case, this woman was using it to upholster a barrel full of rage, because she had grown up in a way that there was real reason for that rage. But she had determined that she would be not a raging person, yet the fire was burning brightly and furiously within her. And the thing is, that these things can be felt by sensitive people around us, no matter how sweetly we act. She didn't understand that in order to become free of it, she had to work with the feelings. In this particular case, Nick Lee worked with her and asked her to list all the people she knew who were angry. And somehow a light bulb went on for this woman that anger was not the cancer within herself. Anger was something that everybody experienced. She was not alone. And for her, being alone was resulting in a grave attempt to be the sweetest, kindest person in the world, so that she would not be alone, so that she would be respected and cared about. This is a common situation. And the only way out of it is to recognize that we are feeling certain ways. And sometimes there's really legitimate reasons for that. A lot of people come to Zen practice having experienced abuse in their life, either psychological or emotional and mental, or physical or sexual abuse. And they come seeking a way of peace, and assuming that acting peaceful is going to get rid of the underlying genuine rage against what happened to them. But it doesn't. And the other side of it is that people see through it. The good part of it was that this woman did recognize that her rage was legitimate, that she was not the only person in the world that was angry, and it was okay to work with the anger. And I'm sure it took her a while to work with the anger, but eventually she became free of it and no longer had to pretend that she was the most compassionate, caring person in the world. The thing is, overtly, it's a pretend, but in actuality, once we are able to process through the anger behind it, the genuine compassion and caring comes out. And it's for real. It's not a cover-up. That's only one of the things that can come up in Zen practice. But as that person who had that Kensho said, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. And at the beginning of that sesshin, that person who was called Carol in the letter that Roshi shared, but I know who it was. And as a matter of fact, she's living in Santa Fe these days, many, many decades later. But she wrote about how she had to virtually nail herself to the mat. She wanted to flee the Zendo. And this is another thing that can come up for us. It's a sense that the place is dangerous. And so we get into a revolving door with teachers and places of practice, trying to find the place that will cure us, that will relieve our underlying suffering. And it doesn't work until we open and turn and face it and experience it and allow it to process. And sometimes that processing needs a therapist to help, particularly if it's been a seriously abusive history. Even if it hasn't, sometimes it makes a difference to work with a therapist. All the Zen therapists that I know personally, with whom I've trained side by side in Rochester, including Bodhin Roshi's wife, Angela, who's a clinical psychologist, and several others, they all say that when a person is doing therapy, along with their Zen practice, both their therapy and their Zen practice are exponentially helped. And that does make a huge difference. This is the difference between trying to struggle through working with Zen practice in the way that a Japanese person would work through it. There's less stuff for a Japanese person to get caught in, although there is still stuff. And there's an infamous case of Shibayama Zenkei's Dharma successor hanging himself with his shukin, the belt for his robes, during a Rohatsu Sesshin. Something wasn't processed through. And it was in part because of the rigid limitations of the Japanese culture. Torii Enji managed to avoid most of the times when Hakuin urged him to go and teach. But he still was able to disappear sometimes and for extended periods of time, like years, to do deepening practice because he had yearned since he was a small child to do practice and already had one Kensho experience before he even got to Hakuin's temple when he was something like 19, 20, 21. Zen practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught. And if we're willing to walk right into it, no matter how painful, how frustrating, how angering it may be, it sets us free when we do the work. I leave this with you. Hopefully it will inspire you and maybe shed some light on anything that might be going on with you at this time. It's something that I brought up at this time because we've already been through a single sesshin and some fairly serious, although not as serious as it could have been, Zen training in the few days intervening. And so this is the time when these kinds of things can come up for people. And now you have this whole sesshin to work on it. What an amazing gift. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.